Awesome. 605, 50 plus. Looks like quite a good number to get started on, I'd say. Hopefully if people trickle in, they'll just be missing the intro. So we'll go from there. Cool. Okay. So welcome everyone to a DEVS Australia interviewing workshop. My name's Adam. I'll be partly taking you through today. We've also got Lily, who'll let introduce yourself. Yeah, sorry. Nice wave there too. Yeah, no, that's what I was meaning. Cool. Okay. So the sort of agenda, I guess, tonight that we're going to take you through will be having a look through a brief introduction, a bit more devs and a bit of housekeeping. We're going to head over to teacher for some information on acing the interview. We'll then take you through the sort of 3 stages of the interview: before the interview, during the interview, and post-interview. Then we've got a couple of mock interviews to show you, and even a chance for you to do some too. So there's a lot to look forward to coming up, but we'll get cracking into it. So first things first, if I find the right thing to click on. Sweet. So first of all, we'd like to say a big thanks to our sponsors that help make these events possible. Obviously, mentioned Potentia, but there's also Sensnet, Atlassian, Serato, Nintex, Optiver, Xero, Canva, and Gather, who's providing the platform for tonight. So big thank you to all of them. In a bit of housekeeping, if you haven't been in Gathertown before, Spotlight tiles will broadcast you to everyone. So that's where I'm standing, as is Lily, up on top of the stage there. Just be aware of that before you walk in, that you will start getting your audio and visuals broadcast to everyone, so only do it if you really need to. But that does mean that there's a small box up the top by the stage where you can walk up and ask questions, and that means that you're for the same thing, audio and visual will come through to us, and we'll be able to have a chat and answer any of those questions. So feel free to do that as it comes through. Also in Gathertown, there's these private spaces where if you're in that space, only the people that are also in that space can hear your video and hear you talk. I see your video and hear you talk. So if you need any help, there's one of those at the bottom of the room we're in now, and also in some of the other rooms as we go to breakouts later. Just keep that in mind. If you do end up going through, have a look out for our devs. You'll find us because we've got a very cool academic hat on, and also we'll have devs at the beginning of our name, like you should be able to see up for me here. So hopefully that helps you to find us. If you've got any questions as well, but you don't feel like coming up and ask them, or it's kind of mid-flow, you're welcome to chuck them through on Menti, and we'll try and answer them as we see them come through. Great. So let's get started with our content. So interviewing in Australia can be pretty different from New Zealand. These differences can include like an earlier timeline and a higher level of competition. So you may need to cater your preparation accordingly in order to really ace those Australian interviews. You can even apply for some of those internships right now. So before you start panicking, there is that big question of how are you going to ace that interview, which leads really nicely into our presentation from, oh, another slide. Oh, a repeat. What's going on? That was meant to lead really nicely into Potentia. There we go. My slides went wrong. So I'll pass over to Julian with a slight mishap there to take it away for us.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate it. Nice introduction. Thank you, everyone, for turning up tonight. I know it's Friday night. I'm proud of everyone for turning up at 6 o'clock on Friday night. No doubt you can sit behind your screens and enjoy yourselves a non-alcoholic and alcoholic beverage, or even a pot of noodles. I heard a lot of noodle slurping while the microphones were on last night when we did the presentation then. I'm going to throw up some slides in a second. And the purpose of today is to provide a staged kind of for you. As Adam said, interviewing at the company that you want to work for is bound to be competitive, right? Because they're going to be a great employer. And so what I want to do today is help you to better perform in that situation. And look, it's a pretty straightforward and logical approach. And if you follow these steps, you're going to put yourself in give the best chance of performing well in these meetings. Now, no doubt, because of the pandemic, everyone's pretty comfortable with VCs and doing stuff online now. So this is catered towards both in-person interviews as well as being VC-based. Today, I am joined by my wonderful colleague, smart and beautiful Moy, who's up here with me. She'll give you a wave. And I think she might talk a little bit about CV preparation as well. So she'll talk a little bit about CVs if we get the time, and I will talk about interviewing. So is that right, Roy? Yeah, yes. Great, cool. All right. So what I'll do is I'll start off with sharing my screen, and you guys and you folk can have a look at the content. Just give me 2 ticks. All right. Just Adam, can everyone see that? Is that okay? Great. Cool. All right. So this has been prepared by my marketing people. So I've had no hand in the way it looks. It looks delightful, but the content is mine. All right. So when you are thinking about an interview, probably the easiest way to think about it is just like any performance. For those who have done any public speaking or any stage work, really, what is the secret to success? Well, preparation and practice. So what the message, if you take away nothing from this talk, please remember that actually it's about the preparation and the practice that you do before you even start that interview. Running things, what is the old adage? With no planning, you planning to fail, or something like that. Can't remember what it is, but basically it is that better prep equals better performance. Okay. So the first thing you want to do before you even apply for a role is to make sure that you're a fit for this business. Now, for those who were here last night, we talked about your purpose and play and making sure that the organization agrees with your values. We'll do some research before you even apply. And so that's about understanding your own values and your interests and making sure that they resonate with that company. It's about also making sure that you're ready for that opportunity. What does that mean? It means that you want to go ahead and you want to sanitize your social media. What does that mean? It means turn on to some stuff that's the private settings. If you've got a few photos which may not represent you in the way that you want an employer to recognize you, sanitize that stuff. Every piece of digital real estate needs to line up with who you are, both in a professional and in a personal sense. You shouldn't be ashamed of interests or any kind of odd things that you like doing, but make sure that when an employer does the research on you, just like when you go dating, they're going to look for your digital real estate, and they're going to have a look at it. So make sure that the platforms that you're on and the online presences that are publicly available represent you and the way that you want to be perceived. If you haven't gone ahead and built your LinkedIn profile, for example, or if you're a developer and you don't have a GitHub account, get onto that stuff. Make sure that you've got some kind of professional assets out there that people can find. And that so when this person does do the digging, or if they do the digging after the interview, that everything's already there. You've already got commentary, you've got code submitted, you've got a LinkedIn profile so they can see that you have some kind of degree or how far you are through that degree. And you've got some reference material, not just Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat. And then if you have the time, now is the time to start doing this stuff if you haven't done it already, is share your messages. So the things that you're interested in, start liking it, start posting about it, start discussion groups, start making sure that you're making contributions, as I said, to GitHub or Stack Overflow. And so that people know that you are already interested in the career that you're pursuing before you even get that job. So before you even apply, make sure that all your house is in order. That makes sense. Now, the next piece of groundwork that you want to do, obviously, better prep equals better performance. You want to do some research yourself on that particular organization if you haven't done it already. Now, what is this about? In an interview, yes, you're trying to look good, you're trying to be able to say the right things, but ultimately what you're trying to do is leave a strong impression and build some relationships. So find out about those people. Now, that doesn't mean going and trying to figure out if they're a motorcycle enthusiast and telling them all about the Harley that you own. It's not about that stuff. It's about finding out what that person's like, finding out about what their interests are, how long they've been with the business, so that you know a little bit more coming into that organization, into that situation, so that you can build a relationship more swiftly with that person. The company, know about its values. If there's something that disagrees with or you really agree with, make sure that you highlight that. Make sure that if you've worked in, an experimental project in fintech and they're a fintech business, that you can talk about it. Make sure that you know what the aspects of the role actually include. So, for instance, if you're going in for a test analyst role, find out what a tester does, and then be able to talk about those things and bring an analog kind of experiences to that around, if they're a tester and there's an analysis involved, What kind of analysis have you done? Make sure you understand the role, the outputs, ask about what the successful metrics are, and then try and figure out how you can craft a response to those things before you even step into that video conferencing or into the interview room. In addition to that, you want to be able to figure out what the current state of that industry and organization is. So for example, if you're going for an interview with Atlassian, what's their share price? What's the level of competition that they've got? Is Octopus Deploy kicking their ass in the DevOps side of things? Or is Atlassian absolutely rinsing everyone globally? So knowing about the context and situation is actually pretty easy to understand if you're looking at their LinkedIn account, if you do a search on the news articles about them. So you've got some real good context and some clarification around the situation that they're in right now. Not like what they were 5 years ago, but right now. What's their pain? What's their success? So that you can understand and bring context to the experiences you have when they're asking you questions. I might have a little pause there so that if anyone's got any questions, that they can write them down and put them in the Menti chat. Now, the next bit is being able to describe your experiences. Now, you might sort of pop your hand up here and be like, well, hang on, I'm a student. I haven't got any work experience. I'm not working on an internship. I don't have any projects that are live. Well, that's okay. What we're thinking about here is, again, being able to draw parallels with the responsibilities or the outputs that are in this role. So, for example, in the modern kind of day curriculum inside a university, you're going to have project groups that you're working on. You're going to have specific outputs. You're going to be graded on those things. And the roles that you have within them are analogous to some of the roles that you'll have inside that working environment. So when you talk about your work experience, you want to draw attention to things like, I don't know, if you've worked in some kind of retail outfit, what are the actual responsibilities and how do they track across? They know you're a graduate. They're not expecting you to say that you've written the most recent crypto coin code. They're going to be expecting you to be able to draw parallels between what they're doing and what you've done in the past. Now, ideally, you will have done your own projects. You will have done some work, and you can describe the responsibilities that you've had, and then be able to bring some anecdotes that you think are relatable to the situation that they're in and or the job that they're that you're interviewing for. Bearing in mind, this is all the preparation that you're doing prior to walking into this interview, right? This is not stuff you want to be able to make up on the fly. When you're thinking about academic projects and experience, you're going to clarify the fact that they are academic projects and that it's something that has been done inside the guardrails of the university system. Now, if you've gone on to commercialize that or run you've taken your research or your project and you've kind of worked with some of your buddies to be able to bring that thing to life and make it into a bona fide piece of software or a device or an API or whatever that thing is, then definitely make that linkage and then obviously be able to show off the code or show off some diagrams or some wireframes. If it's a project that exists outside of the technology industry, so some of you might be doing double majors or you might be doing some stuff on the side, then that's going to be relevant as well. So thinking about, again, the responsibilities that you've had. If you're in a project, for example, in a non-technical field, typically you'll still have a leader of that group or a project manager or an analyst or someone who's doing the content creation. And so those are things you want to draw to their attention and talking about both the quantitative and qualitative evidence. So you're going to say, well, we did this in this particular time frame. It got these grades. And it's because we worked as a group. My job was doing this. We did this, and this was what the output was. So those kinds of things are going to be things that you just want to take notes around and practice talking about prior to walking into this interview. When we're talking about fit and potential, what we mean by that is you're trying to extrapolate on the things that you're good at now that you think will be involved with your career inside that organization. So for example, you might say, well, my natural characteristics is I'm the person that organizes everything. I'm the person that organizes everything for my friends when we go on trips. I'm the person that organizes everything involved with the team and the project team. So I'm the person that makes sure that we deliver when we need to and to the sufficient level of quality expected around this project, or around the curriculum, or around the type of experience we're having on our New Year's trip. So those kinds of things are characteristics that you think will extrapolate out and make you a good fit for the role, just based upon your natural kind of strengths and the things that you've been typically good at in the past in those kinds of working environments or in those project environments. It's a little bit different from what we spoke about before. And then also what you want to do is do some research and then prepare some insightful questions. Now, these are not things like, tell me about your benefit scheme. That's something that you should be able to figure out early on. We're talking about things like, it seems that you've hired a lot of people with Agile and Scrum skills recently. Is that the processes and the methodologies that you use there? What's made that really successful for you? How do you know it's successful? So that's something that's quite insightful, right? You've had to think about it. You've done a bit of research on the people they've employed, or you might have looked at their kind of their handbook that's available in the public forum, so that you differentiate yourself by showing the level of insight and depth of research that you can be involved with. You can see that, it's not just an interview, right? Like, you've done all of this preparation and all this thinking and all of this practice of these kinds of explanations, or you've kind of thought about these questions so that you're showcasing the best version that you can project in that kind of situation. That is not going to happen if you turn up without any preparation. Now, typically, you'll face some questions. So tell me about yourself, which I think is probably one of the most difficult questions that ever gets asked in an interview, because there's no right answer. Now, so you need to choose and expect that question to come up. And the way that you can go about that is to just talk about the things that really resonate for you in your experience. This is not related to the slide, but they will ask you icebreaker style questions. Icebreaker style questions is just to get you talking. And it's up to you to ask icebreaker questions too. How's your day going? Hey, it seems that you guys are super busy at the moment. What's coming up in the project pipeline? So those are things that are just going to build a little bit of rapport, but expect them to do the same for you. Now, when you get down to the nitty gritty, there's going to be some really specific questions. So tell me about, that project that you did, or tell me about what you think is the most important achievement that you've had in your career so far. Tell me about the most important project that you've had in your academic career. So these are pretty typical benchmark style questions when you don't have a lot of working experience to draw from. Now, if you've got working experience, you want to highlight that stuff. If you've got project experience that you've done with your buddies in the community, just building something for a hobby, talk about it. That demonstrates passion, because you've gone ahead and done something even though you're not going to get paid for it. That is absolute gold to someone who has never worked in that industry before. So if you haven't got a little project going with your buds, now's the time to kick it off. So when they're talking to you about project-based or academic experiences, they're going to want a pretty structured answer. So you have one chance to answer that question. So I'd advise you to think about the structure of that answer being built in the STAR format. Some of you may have heard of the STAR format before, but let me just walk you through what that means. So you've got a situation, task, action, and results. Situation: tell the story. We're humans. We want to hear stories. If you practice the story, it's a hell of a lot better. No doubt within your circle of friends, you'll have the person that's really good at telling stories, and you will have heard that story 20 times in 2 years. And so you want to have some good stories to tell, and that just takes practice. Taking down the notes, bullet it out, think about the chronology of what it is you want to say, and then practice telling that story. And that might be about your testing role within an academic project. It could be about anything. The task. So what you then want to do is you want to frame up what those responsibilities were. So for example, if your time is like a pie chart, how do you cut that up? How much was analysis? How much was design? How much was testing? How much was coding, for example, of in software? And you can do that for any particular role that you've had inside those projects. The next bit is actually about telling the story. So the situation is about framing the situation. The story is actually about, the context, what actually happened. You had these tasks, you had these responsibilities. So what happened? So sorry to run that through, but this is where you need to practice, and you need to practice framing it. You need to practice telling the story. The results. So people want to know the story. That's what gets them emotionally engaged. They want to understand the framing that understands, what it is that you're actually going to be talking about. But then they want to know what the results are. And results are really quantitative. So they need to be numbers, percentages, costs, times, things that make you understand it's been successful or not. So if you haven't got those measures in place at the start of that econometric project, now's the time to make that shit up. Because if you don't, then they're not going to believe that you've actually thought about what those results will look like to work that hard to get those results. So make sure that you've got quantitative results available when you're talking about the projects that you've been involved with. The next part is really understanding what it is that you are going to be doing after you've answered that question. So these kind of standardized questions, to be able to ensure that there's a dialogue happening, you want to say, does that make sense? Do you have any other things that you'd like to know about that project? These are kind of catchphrases that you want to say at the end of when you finish talking. So for example, often people say, does that make sense? Or they might say, is that all the information that you wanted? Or do you have any questions? What that allows you to do is hand back the dialogue to them and for them to be able to give you clarification, because it may be that you've missed out on something that they really wanted to know. And if you don't ask that question, they're not going to ask that question themselves. And then if you don't understand the question, you're feeling super nervous, first thing you want to do is restate the question. So tell me about the project that you've been involved with. Let me tell you about the project that I've been involved with while I was at the University of Auckland in the computer science department. That's then giving you a whole bunch of time to make you feel comfortable about what it is that you're going to be talking about. Sounds like someone's out on the bus. The next piece is that you've got asking for more information. If that question doesn't make sense, then you need to be able to ask for clarification. What does that mean? It means to say, if they're saying, hey, tell me about this project, which project would you like to hear about? Cool. I'll move on. So whoever's come online recently, maybe they could mute their mics. Thanks. The next part is actually the piece. It's going a little bit deeper into the pieces that we talked about previously. So when you're asking questions to show your knowledge, that's kind of like saying that you've done the preparation, you've done the analysis of what you expect to be asked about. And so that you've shown that you've done the research. The only way that you can show that you've done the research is by asking them questions for clarification about what's happening in that company. So the way I do it is I break it down into 4 different groups. And these should be questions that you write down. Again, not tell me about your benefits, what am I going to get paid? It's about understanding the situation that the company's in. Okay, it seems like there's quite a lot going on in the Atlassian ecosystem at the moment. So tell me about that. What are the things that you think are keeping you up at night? What are the things that are going really well? Industry related. It seems that there's a real shortfall in talent out there. What are you guys finding that you are having real difficulty hiring? Or what are the different technologies that are coming up that you think are going to be cool as far as experimenting with your interface development? Role related, what are the things that make the most successful testers? What are the things that make people most successful as developers in your environment? So these kinds of questions. And then values and purpose related. What is your latest engagement metrics? Can you tell me more about what are the things that people do inside this organization that demonstrate that they're living to the values of the business? So these kinds of questions show that you've actually thought about it, you've done some research, and there are holes in your knowledge that you'd like to know more about more deeply. So all of that is all about the preparation that you do before you even start the interview, which seems like a lot. But hey, if you get one shot at an interview at Atlassian or at Canva or anything like that, and you really want to work there, then it's worth doing all of that work and then practicing those answers with your mates or with your lecturer or with your folks or with your siblings to make sure that it's all coming off really nicely. And the reason that you do that is that so you are so confident about the content that you've got and the questions that you've got that you can respond in a way in that interview and build those relationships. Because if you've only done this once, it's like any kind of performance, like in drama or in sports or in any kind of public speaking. If you haven't done it enough times, then you're going to get to a point where you're feeling nervous and your mind goes blank. But if you've done it a whole bunch of times, it allows you to react and respond and then interview in a natural and confident way, even if you are more of an introverted person. On the day of the interview, again, it's all about preparation and planning. So ensuring that you've downloaded Zoom if you haven't got Zoom, right? Don't end up in a situation where you're going to be nervous because you've got all this stuff to do before the interview. Make sure your battery's charged on your laptop. Make sure all of that stuff is there. And make sure that you're feeling proud of all the preparation that you've done before that interview starts, leaving nothing to chance. Make sure as well that you're the best dressed. Don't turn up like I am, half shaven, t-shirt on. If you're going to make a great impression, you want to make sure that you're the best dressed person and best groomed person in the meeting. Now, the good news is that software companies are pretty scruffy. So even if you've got a collar on or you've got a nice blouse on, you're probably going to make a decent impression. Make sure that you got your notes and materials all planned out and all there for you. Again, it doesn't necessarily need to be on your laptop. It might be paper, it might be printouts, it could be anything. Again, make sure that you're arriving a little early to the VC or to the destination that you're at. And be nice to everyone. Like one of the great, terrible stories that I heard was this person came in and they nailed their interview. They absolutely nailed it. They were going to get an offer. And the great shame was that they were really mean to the receptionist on the way out. They were rude. They were dismissive. And that got back to those interviewers. And so that person never got a job. Now that happens. And you know what? If you're a stink person, then you deserve not to get that interview or get that job. But the reality is that you need to be behaving in a way with every person that you interface with. Respond to emails swiftly. Be nice to everyone. Smile. Make eye contact. And then be upbeat. Like, it's a stressful situation, but remember that if you're not having fun, you're probably not going to have a great experience, and neither are they, which is why you do all that preparation and all that planning and execute in a way that you can be yourself. Now, actually, in the interview, I just mentioned this stuff, make eye contact. I know it's scary making eye contact with people, especially online, because you're staring into these pools of their eyes, right? But actually, you don't need to be staring at them the whole time. You can just make sure that you're referencing that eye contact and make sure that you're speaking clearly. Look at the camera. Don't look at the screen. That's always a good rule to think about. If you're in person, shake hands. Make sure that your hands aren't too clammy. Give them a wipe before you shake hands. And make sure you got a good firm grip. Try not to interrupt people. Like, I know that you might want to get it out and there's a question that comes to mind, but if that question comes to mind, write it down on the pad that you've got. Let people have their turn of speaking. I said this before, but it's a really useful technique, is to restate the question. So tell me about the coolest experience that you've had in your technology career. Yeah, I'd love to tell you about the greatest experience that I've had in my technology career. Gives you just a little bit of time to think about the response that you want to say. Ask your questions once they ask if you have any. And if they don't ask if you've got any questions, just say, hey, would you mind if I asked you some questions myself? That's perfectly reasonable, but don't ask the questions until they've finished their assessment. Write everything down that you want to follow up on and follow up with it really swiftly. And make sure that you are asking for their contact details to follow up with. I know that seems a bit scary, but having that person's email address or having their phone number means that you can personally interface with them. Even if you don't get a job that time, it may be that in 12 months that you're able to access that relationship and get the job. And it's kind of a little bit of an Americanization, but I encourage everyone, especially when they're early on in their interviewing career, to ask for feedback, because it gives them an opportunity to say what you've done well, and it gives you an opportunity to find out the bits that you can improve on. Because I guarantee you this will not be the only interview that you ever have in your life. And obviously follow up with everything. The way that you behave in the interview is the way that they believe that you will behave as an employee. And so if they ask you to do something or you commit to something to follow up, do it. So I've got a suggestion, and I'm not quite sure how this is going to play out and gather, but I can kind of see that lots of people are in groups of people that kind of know each other. And so what I was going to encourage you to do, Adam, is this okay? I'm not sure whether it's going to work out or not, but
happy to give it a go. See what it
yeah.
works.
So this is the worst question that you're going to get asked in an interview. Well, maybe not the worst, but it's probably pretty common. And that is, tell me about your experience, right? Or tell me about yourself. And so if you are next to someone and you can interface with them and you can talk to them, then I'd encourage you to try this out. Now, if it doesn't work in Gather, that's fine. But definitely give this a go outside of Gather with your buddies so that you can get a bit level of familiarity with practicing how to respond to these kinds of questions. That make sense? Is that going to work, Adam and Lily? I'm not sure it will.
I'm not sure. Well, what we could do as well is, because we're still broadcasting, we can let people kind of go into groups and give that a go if they can. But at the same time, I can probably ask a couple of questions from Minty and just that will kind of take us through time-wise. Does that work?
Yeah.
So one of the first ones we've had come through here is from Rishi, and he asks, if we were to deep dive into looking at the company specifically, and their working conditions, values, what other resources can we utilize apart from the company website, which is often biased?
There's lots of things that you can look at, right? Glassdoor has employee experience reviews, although it's a little dangerous looking at that stuff and then quoting it out. There are resources that you can look into, for instance, on LinkedIn, that will tell you all about the company, about what they're posting about. Most of them have got social media accounts, which will allow you to see what they're interested in and what they're kind of celebrating at the moment. Other resources include, if they're listed, you can look at their the information that's available about them online from analysts, etc. And then you can have a look at particular employees who are senior leaders in the organization and kind of see what they're talking about. Those are really good resources to look at. That's probably about it. Moy, is there anything else that I could mention there?
Don't think so.
Cool. Okay, thank you for that. I'll follow up with the next one here. Oh, questions popping in quicker than I can answer them. People say, JL says, employers like metrics and numbers. How do you generate metrics if they're not tracked within your role?
You should be tracking them. Any role has metrics attached to it, right? Sales, customer service, development. It's up to you to surface those things. It would be a real surprise if something's not being tracked. If you're in your job and you're not tracking metrics, then I suggest you start tracking them. Other than that, you can look at things like costs, times, traction, all of those things. Or even you can look at anecdotal evidence, like customer reviews, etc. Hopefully that's helpful.
Awesome, yeah. Got a couple more, I think. So Merrick asks, are there any websites besides seek.com.au that you recommend for finding graduate roles across the ditch?
Yeah, look, I'm a little bit, what do I want to say? So Seek's pretty good. But what I would probably be looking at, if you can't find enough graduate roles, I'd be going to the organizations themselves and looking at the career websites. And LinkedIn, each company has a LinkedIn page and there are jobs attached to that. That will allow you, if they're not advertising for stuff, then you can go to the different leaders in that organization, or you can and send them a connection request to figure out what's going on within their organization. Also, going to meetups, seeing who's going to the meetups, seeing who's actually active in those meetups, and going to those meetups and then connecting with that person afterwards. Sometimes they'll say, hey, we're looking for graduates at the moment.
Awesome. Great. And the final question, I think, is when's the most ideal time to ask for feedback? Immediately after your interview finishes, or after the rejection email, or kind of what stage in the process?
Yeah, I would say at the end of the interview. You can, if you do get a rejection, often they've kind of dismissed you at that point, and they're probably not as likely to invest time in it. at the time, they're going to give you a good summary.
Cool. Okay, perfect. I think that's all we've got on mentees. That probably covers us there. But thank you very much for that, Julian. That's really awesome. If there's kind of any questions, people can fire them through, and maybe we'll get to them a bit later on. But no, I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through that today. Thank you.
Cool, no worries. And has Moy got time to give you a little bit of a breakdown around CVs?
Yeah, for sure. Would love that.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't actually have a slide or anything like that. But I think, you know, as Julian has mentioned, what you'll realize as you're doing more and more interviews is that it is your skills and it is culture fit that will ultimately get you the job. But your CV is the most important marketing collateral that you have before you get to that point. So it's really important to make sure that your CV reflects you. It's your chance, you know, to get in front of a potential employer. It's your chance to impress the hiring manager, the talent manager, or the recruiter, and you've got a really short window. So maybe like 2 to 5 minutes is probably the average that I'll spend looking at a CV. So you want to make sure that your CV, you know, is the best before you do all that prep. This is the, you know, the foundation document. And some of the key things sometimes are missed, like you'd be surprised. So make just a few tips, like making sure that your CV matches your LinkedIn profile. So if you don't have a LinkedIn profile at the moment, build one, and making sure that everything on your CV matches your LinkedIn profile, because often recruiters or hiring managers will go and check your LinkedIn profile at the same time as you're looking at your CV. Just ensuring that you have all of your information correct. So, you know, phone number, email, how will they get in touch with you? Ensuring that the tech language or your knowledge is clear on your CV. So separated ideally into front end and back end. Cover letters, they don't need to be too long. I mean, really 2 paragraphs is maximum. Alternatively, what you can do is have like a short paragraph on your CV, you know, about who you are, what you're looking for. Yeah, and I think, you know, if you include that on your CV, it'll, you know, most likely get read as well as part of your CV. So in terms of, you know, work experience, I know you won't have a lot right now, but what you can do is, as Julian mentioned, is include all those projects that you did at uni. So, you know, showcase, have them in detail, you know, and talk about the role that you played in the project. So if you were a leader, showcase those leadership skills. What technologies have you had exposure to? So if you say self-taught, so say you've self-taught yourself, you've taught yourself React or something like that, you can add all the languages that you've had exposure to, so it shows that you've got initiative. Maybe just in brackets, but like self-taught, if that's the case. Put your degree, obviously all your main subjects, your majors, your minors, and in terms of internship experience, chronological order, current to past, and if you have any work that you've done on a professional network like GitHub, make sure you add all those links. They're really useful. And as Julian mentioned, you know, that when everyone knows that you're a grad, so they're not expecting you to have screeds of paper with lots of experience, but it's just about making everything clear, formatted correctly, and just making sure everything looks professional. That's all.
Well said, Moy.
Yeah. So I was just about to echo that. That's fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Moy. Looks like there might be 1 or 2 more questions. So might ask you that if that's okay, and then move on to the next part. So, oh, how many are there now?
Hey, Adam.
Yeah, sure.
There's a couple of questions that are sitting in the chat that I can answer as well.
Go ahead. Yep, perfect. Thank you.
So Rishi said, is there a line we shouldn't cross for job-related questions that might feel probing and hence be seen as someone prying on future projects? I don't think so. I mean, like, you're not going to steal their IP. So I think that you don't need to really worry about that. If you've done some heavy digging and you've cracked some cryptographics and stuff, then maybe don't ask those questions. But don't worry about it too much. I think they're mainly going to see it as insightful, as long as you're doing it for the right reasons. 1 or 2 page CV in New Zealand and Australia, maximum 4 pages. Most really good CVs can fit it within 2 or 3.
Awesome. I think there's one other question here I can see, which is, do you believe a short blurb or introduction on your resume is necessary or just optional?
I think it is necessary because it does show, it showcases your personality and the kind of person you are, and it could potentially show whoever's reading the CV that you're a match for that business that you're wanting to work for. So I do think it is important.
Awesome.
Just a little one. Just a little one.
Yeah, just a small one. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. And probably our last question we'll have time for is, would it be good to put education section down if I don't have an impressive GPA or stuff in uni? From James.
Hey. So, I mean, I think practical experience is more important than academic experience. Showcasing the fact that you've done stuff in your own time and done hobby projects, and you've got, like Moy was saying, you've submitted stuff into GitHub, you've got the links on there. I mean, they're going to ask, right? It's because it's a graduate role. They're going to ask you what your GPA is. It's about understanding that that's not the one thing. It's all the other bits that you've done that are important as well. And if you come up and you're prepped and you've got a good game in that interview, it's going to do you a world of good.
Awesome. Okay. That sounds really good. Thank you. So I think that's probably all we've got time for question-wise. But again, thank you very much, Julian and Moy, for presenting tonight. It's fantastic information. Hope everyone's gained a lot from that. So yeah, thanks for coming along.
Yeah, cheers.
No worries, Ben. Been a pleasure. And those slides will be available. I'll send them through to admin Lily.
Fantastic. And we'll pass them on along with our ones. Yeah, thanks very much. Great. So I'll just get back into sharing. 1 moment while I do. Sweet. Hopefully that pops back up. Sweet. So moving on. So our next section is before the interview. So this is as we move into some of the more technical stuff. This potentially took us through more of the kind of behavioural or softer skill stuff. But this is really when we get into the nitty gritty, especially for Australia, where the bar might be a bit higher for some of those bigger companies. So I'll let Lily take it away.
Great. Cheers, Adam. So essentially, before the interview, what do you want to do? Your CV's in check. You've applied. You've got into your interview. But now here it comes. What do you do to prepare? What we would say to that is there are a lot of different ways to prepare for interviews, and there's no one perfect solution. But getting more experience, especially with these interviews, will help you get to your end goal. Getting started as early as possible as well then gives you that best advantage, both because you're going through more interviews or that have the opportunity to, as well as just giving yourself that time to prep and learn. So what we would propose are 3 key areas of focus. 1, the coding interview. 2, behavioural interview, which a lot has been covered by Julian already. And then 3, building up a portfolio to support yourself in this process. So, thank you. So the coding interview, essentially this is probably one of the biggest grinds because it can be really daunting at first, but once you gain that familiarity with practice, it gets a lot easier and you start to get a lot more familiar with what might come up. What we would say is a good approach to just getting used to these and tackling the coding interview is starting easy. Practice common questions related to data structures and algorithms on websites such as LeetCode, HackerRank, or Codility. Find one that works for you and find one that has solutions that you understand and questions that are clear to you and will get you to utilize the skills that you don't know how to use yet. From there, we'd say work your way up, work your way to more complex problems, improve over time, and then learn from your mistakes. A lot of companies will utilize easy to medium questions, but then some of them will really utilize difficult ones, such as the fintech companies. So if that's your end goal, then getting familiar with that level of difficulty and getting sort of more fluid with your approaches is something that will really help your application. And furthermore, you'll get that time relative to the level of the difficulty that you're approaching. So if you've got a hard question, you really want to be able to utilize your time wisely rather than just Googling everything. Take it from experience. So in order to really ace these coding interviews, whether it be one-on-one or just doing a one-way coding through HackerRank or otherwise, it really helps to familiarize yourself with widely accepted languages. Some of the ones we've listed here, things like Python, C++, and Java, they're really commonly used if you're looking for fintech especially, or JavaScript, which is also just a really common language. But with a lot of wider companies, you will find that their coding interviews that they'll apply to you, you'll get the option of what language you want to do for the one-way, and then they'll give you still, I think, some choices for if you are coding one-on-one with one of the interviewers. It also really pays to practice whiteboarding your solutions to problems to avoid using Google or an IDE for assistance. This especially comes through with companies such as Google, where you pretty much end up in a Google Doc and you're coding it all with no sort of suggestion and minimal Googling. And the same with Canva, where they essentially ask you to show your screen while you're Googling. So all your solutions will either come from documentation or on the fly. Memorizing these common data structures and functions that come with your language of choice then really helps to support that, so you don't have to go to that documentation and you don't have to just assume what it will be. So cracking the coding interview, which we will discuss in a bit more depth in a few minutes, it contains more information about how to prepare for the coding interview. Even if you don't think it's the best book out there, it really is industry standard. So recruiters will expect you to know it and understand its content and then be able to utilize the concepts as well. So we've already had a lot of sort of depth to behavioral interview, but we've got just, I think, an additional point here of just preparing for those questions themselves. A lot of them come through in the same way with different companies. So questions such as just basic, why do you want the role? What are your career goals, etc. Being prepared for these questions and making sure that you're in it for the right reasons are always, as already highlighted, really key. And then having that answer prepared as well is something that you can do beforehand. You don't want to necessarily sound scripted, but you also don't want to just be pretending you understand the company. You want to be there for genuine reasons, and they'll be able to tell as well. With companies such as Optiver and IMC, you can also expect to end up in 45-minute behavioral interviews where they're really going to try see if your values align with the company. So making sure that you're prepared for that is something that will really help you get ahead. Secondly, we would say building a portfolio. So for example, showing the projects you've worked on that prove your skills. Having your portfolio hosted on something like GitHub, which is really common, or your own website allows employers to see the work that you've done and just really showcase examples of languages you can utilize or previous experience, and then also being able to leverage this previous experience and talking about the projects you've built, which you can then utilize as answers for questions such as what's a challenge you faced, or just having an engaging conversation in of itself. So finally, we'd be saying think long term, depending on the roles you're looking at. If it's something, say, looking at DevOps or wanting to work with Salesforce, having those qualifications beforehand can really help get you a leg up into those industries. So you can look at certified shorter programs from sites such as Udacity, which also have a wide range looking into things such as mobile programming, or AWS certifications, and then Salesforce again, where they will really help to just administer those certs, and then you'll be able to utilize it further down the line. So now that's your pre-interview, but we've gotten into the interview. So what do you do then? First of all, I think the key rule of thumb is always try your best and try and just calm those nerves. It really does not help, especially if you're stumbling or it's just making you kind of lose your train of thought. But when you get there, there are also some other really good things to think about while you're in the interview. The first is asking yourself, what is the end goal? If you've got an interview where they either really just want you to pass test cases or really want you to focus on how quick the solution is, then make sure you've got to focus on that and you're explaining how you're reaching that goal. But this leads into talking through the ideas. Why did you choose a specific data structure? Why would you use this algorithm? What are the approaches you've used and why? The interviewer will really care about how you engage with the problem rather than if you get the correct solution on the first go or if you get it just off the bat. Being able to discuss your ideas and the ways that you've reached your solutions is really fundamental to understanding your thinking and how that applies to the wider company. Finally, just engage with your interviewer in of itself. rephrase the problem when they give it to you if that helps your understanding and it makes sure that you're going forward with the right problem. And then it also helps to just ensure you're picking up on cues if you are going off track. So for example, if they ask you, are you sure this is the best solution? What do you think about utilizing this instead? Actually engage with that question. Give yourself time to think, essentially, if you need it, but make sure that you've got a response that's actually thought out and isn't just a one-word yes or no, or just grunting your way through it. They're there to help. So now I'll hand it back to Adam to talk about cracking the coding interview.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so in terms of the cracking the coding interview and how they approach the interview itself, they do have on their website kind of a cheat sheet that you can download, and it does give you kind of a step-by-step guide. And we're just going to walk through those quickly because they do give a really good method, I guess, of approaching those interview questions. So the first step you're meant to look at is to listen. So when the interviewer is giving you the question, quite often it's not in HackerRank, so it's not already written down. They're verbally telling you what the problem is, and you're having to listen to it, understand it, take notes, and go from there. So it's really important you pay close attention to the problem description, specifically to information they give you. As with most questions, they're not trying to give you a whole lot of extraneous information. If you've been given information, it's probably because you need it. So pay close attention to that. You also want to start thinking about other bits of information you might need, such as what you're going to do in edge cases. Common examples is if you've got a function, say, that accepts a list, what happens if the list is empty? Or if it accepts integers, what happens if it's a negative number? Stuff like that where your function will get tripped up, so you want to understand what the desired output is in those cases. In step 2, we want to come up with an example. So we've heard the problem, we've understood it, we need to come up with an example of our own. This is especially important if they haven't actually provided you with an example. So you then can come up with something and check, does this make sense? Am I right? Is this what the answer would be? You also want to make sure in this case that you're not coming up with special cases or kind of edge cases for those default examples. Or if you are, you're doing so intentionally because your function or your code, I guess, could act differently in those particular cases. So you want to make sure that you've got a kind of general one and that if you've got edge cases, you're aware that those are edge cases. And step 3, we've come up with, we've listened, we've come up with our example, and we're ready to start coming up with a solution. We're not actually coding yet. So in the brute force, we want to come up with the simplest solution, the brute force solution. Even if you think this is too easy, you still want to talk about it because the interviewer doesn't know you, doesn't know whether you even understand the brute force method. And it's also a great chance to start thinking about the problem and getting your thoughts together. So even if you think it's the most simple thing ever, say it. Especially important at this stage is also to talk about the space and time complexity. As your brute force solution will likely be suboptimal in space and time, it gives you a really great starting point to then improve your solution and talk about the improvements that you've made. Cool. So that's our first 3 steps. The next step is to look at optimizing. And again, we still haven't written a line of code here. So after we've come up with our brute force approach, we'll want to try and improve it somehow, and ideally come up with the optimal approach. So the good thing to think about here is what we call our best conceivable runtime. This is for a particular problem, the theoretical best runtime that something could happen in. So for example, if we're talking about, I don't know, adding or subtracting things from a whole list, our best conceivable runtime would be n, where n is the size of the list, because we'd have to visit every single item. So we know that we can't get a solution that would be sublinear. So that's a really good kind of goal that we can then start thinking about our optimal solution, trying to achieve that best conceivable runtime or getting as close to it as possible. We also want to think about, say, greedy versus divide and conquer approaches, what's going to be best suited to the problem, and also recursive versus iterative solutions. Some problems do seem to really fit to recursive solutions, but if they're going to recurse lots and lots of times, that's obviously going to add a whole lot of space onto our stack, and it might not be the best solution. It might be instead better to turn it into an iterative approach that might be slightly more complicated, but save a whole lot of space. So that's something to think about. And it's often a question the interviewer will ask is, what's the difference here between a recursive approach and an iterative approach? So bear that in mind. For step 5, we're going to walk through our solution. So we're going to, this is again, not having written code. That's really going to keep repeating that. We don't write code till really late in this process. So we want to walk through. This is a great time to use one of the examples we've come up with earlier. And we're going to perform error checks. So basically a rubber duck debugging style, where we think through each step and what's going to happen and how we'd approach it until hopefully we've got our final result. So at this stage, we've hopefully thought it through, got to a better solution than brute force, or even if we haven't, we've also walked it through. We're now ready to finally implement. So this is a time when we sort of get to coding, and we'll kind of be talking about what we're doing as we start coding it up. A really important thing to think about while we're implementing is that you can look up the documentation. That's usually allowed, but it's definitely better to know the basic API and commands of the language you're using off by heart. I've been told in multiple of these interviews that not knowing it won't count against you, but knowing it really well will count for you, because it just shows a familiarity with the language and perhaps an aptitude that doesn't necessarily show if you're not doing those things correctly. So even things like good coding style, in Python, say using underscores for naming, whereas in, say, Java, using camel case, keeping those conventions consistent throughout will make a big difference, even if you're coding in something like a Google Doc, which can get tedious, but is still really important. And our final step is to test. So this is another time where we'd go through each line of our code, and we want to really carefully analyze it. We want to make sure that our code, we have to think through what our code actually says, not what we think our code says or what we think we've written. That's another really common pitfall, especially when you're nervous. So going through each line methodically and checking that it does what we think it does. Cool. So those are the 7 steps that we go through in the interview. I know it sounds like a lot, but with practice, it does become much easier. So that takes us through to the post-interview. So congratulations, you've made it through, and regardless of what happens, you have learned something. It really is a situation where practice makes perfect, and you've taken the shot, you've put your hat in the ring, so congratulations to you, and take a moment to reflect on that. Okay, so as we take a moment to reflect, what do we think about? Well, some really good questions to ask yourself is, what went well? What could be improved? What were you blindsided by, if anything? And why do you think it went well or not? Asking these questions will allow you to think really critically about how your interview went and allow you to identify, say, problem areas for the next interview, and strength as well, things that you've done well and that you can be proud of having done well. But that does lead to the question, what if I don't get an offer? Or very much, what's next? So it's okay not to get an offer. It doesn't mean you aren't a great developer. It doesn't even mean necessarily that you weren't well suited to the role. As with exams, with other things, people can have bad interviews, or it can just not go your way. That doesn't mean you're a bad developer, so don't get downhearted by it. Keep that in mind, reflect on it, and use it for next time, and kind of go into the next interview ready to go. As Julian said, though, it is a great time to ask for feedback, and this feedback is crucial for helping you improve for next time. So if there's anything kind of obvious, take that opportunity to see if there was anything else you could have done. And of course, as we mentioned, take the time to reevaluate, but also rest. You've worked hard, congratulate yourself for it, and take it all in your stride. Cool. Okay, so that's kind of our post-interview, and really that's all the notes we have in terms of the interview process itself. So with this, it does seem that the best way to get an understanding of it is to see it happen and to do it yourself. And so that's going to be the next stage of our workshop for today. So first of all, we're going to go through a live demo mock interview with all of the fun awkwardness that comes in an interview. So Lily is going to be our interviewer, and I am going to be the interviewee. So first up, we're going to go through an example of what a perhaps less good interview would look like, doing some things, those common pitfalls that we might want to avoid. And then we're going to do it again with a hopefully slightly better version of it, where we improve on some of those things. I'll just double check there's no questions anywhere. No, cool. Okay. So double check Menti as well. Looks like most of those are CV-based ones.
One or two. I can't remember if the recruiter one was there from the CV, but we have one about, have Australian companies given take-home interview tests? And if so, how do they analyze your work, and what is expected of us for these tests?
Good question. So my understanding of those take-home tests is usually for software development roles, whether that be front-end, back-end, full-stack, sort of security stuff. Any of those areas are typically live coding interviews like we're about to demonstrate. The only ones I've heard that give you take-home test is more for data science roles. So especially in likes of machine learning or actually even just big data processing, you will get given a take-home test. But those are much more specific to those roles. So in, say, a machine learning example, you're given a machine learning problem to do over the course of, say, 24, 48 hours. And then it's marked in the sense of how well is you also produce a report for that. And they'll kind of we'll look at those together and then evaluate it. But those are more for kind of data science or research roles. So they're a slightly different emphasis. So my understanding is for those developer roles, it's typically these live interviews, which we'll get into. Hopefully that helps. Cool. Okay.
I'm just going to quickly jump onto that. I think there are a couple of dev like software roles who will get you to do it, but again, a lot of these are usually not going to be really grand scale problems, and a lot of it is just analysis of how you work. And I don't know if we necessarily count, I guess, those administered hacker rank sort of stay at home and do them, just sort of own in your own time sort of thing. But those ones as well, just to rehash the question, they'll likely analyze things such as, depending on the site, your time complexity, or just sort of how efficient your code is, and just looking at your code in general. Are you using good practices to write it? Is your whole thing just spaghetti code or whatnot? Or just boilerplate? And yeah, looking at things like that. What are your coding practices like as well?
Awesome. That sounds really good. I think actually even the stuff we're about to talk about will be applicable in your approach to those problems too. But yeah, perhaps less of an emphasis because this has also got the live element to it. But in line with that, I will stop sharing that screen and start sharing a code editor, and we'll get started with it. That's my VS Code there. Hopefully that pops up and is visible. Okay, so now we're kind of switching into interview mode. I'm the interviewee, and I'll let our interviewer take it away.
Great. So hey, I'm Lily. I'll be your interviewer today. How's it going?
Good, thanks, Lily. How are you?
Not too bad. So today we'll be going through our coding interview. If you're ready to start.
Yep, I'm ready.
Great. So I'm trying to get my tabs all working. So what we're going to give to you today is a two-sum question. The problem essentially is, let's say we have a list of numbers. We want to find and return two indices in a list such that they add up to a certain target value. So if we had 1, 2, 5, and 9 with a target of 7, we'd want to return indices 1 and 2 because this corresponds to the numbers 2 and 5, which add up to 7. In another example, if we have -1, 3, and 9, and our target is 8, we'd want to return 0 and 2 as our indices because this corresponds to the numbers -1 and 9, which add together to give 8. You may not use the same element twice. Do you have any questions?
That sounds okay. It may not be same twice. Okay, so I'm just going to get started coding, I think.
Cool. So what's your sort of thought process on this? What are you thinking about the problem so far?
I think I'm just going to run through each.
So what are you kind of meaning by run through each?
Like just going to loop through.
Cool. Do you think there are possibly any data structures that could help you?
I don't think so. I think I've got it. I'm nearly finished coding. I think I'll just finish that up now. Just won't be one moment.
No worries.
Cool. Okay, I think I'm done. So that's the end of our little mini interview. A little bit awkward, a little bit fun, but that's exactly how those interviews end up going. So first things first, does kind of look through this. There's a few things hopefully that stand out as being not the right way to approach it. Does anyone, any brave soul want to unmute and give us some suggestions of things that could have gone a bit better in that interview? A way to do that is to come up to that speaker position on the front of the stage and let us know. But if you don't want to, you can also drop it in chat.
So we've got a comment saying that you could have explained how you coded it.
Yep, that's definitely true. I was kind of just powering through it, coding by myself, and not talking about anything I did. So, yep, that's definitely a good one.
Yeah.
Any others?
Got another one saying that you might have brushed off the interview a little bit.
Yes. So when the interviewers ask you questions, they're asking for a reason. They actually want to help you get through the interview. So those probing questions are ones you really want to kind of feed back on and respond to. But I was pretty dismissive and yeah, did certainly brush them off. Any other suggestions?
Clarify your inputs and outputs again, or the inputs and outputs again.
Yep, that's a good idea. And actually coming off the back of that, we didn't do any of the kind of, coming up with our own examples or clarifying questions, looking at any edge cases. I've literally just gone through straight. Didn't ask any questions. Yep, nice. Yep.
Just code out loud, talk about your thought process.
Yeah, all of those are definitely correct. And actually, there's nothing else. I didn't actually go through and test my code either. So especially in examples where you're not doing it in HackerRank, you haven't been given test cases. It's really important that you go through that yourself. Yeah, Rishi got it at the same time. That's cool. So there is actually a mistake in the code that I haven't gotten to. If anyone can spot that, extra points.
Yeah.
But
just got a comment. Did you technically use the same element twice?
That's the mistake. So yes, so especially if we're kind of going through it, I mean, in that example, you'd be returning numsI and numsI. That ends up being the same element. So, good point. Yep, that's our issue. So, from that perspective, hopefully that gives you an idea of maybe a little bit of what not to do. So let's try this again with a hopefully slightly improved version. So I'll get my code editor in the right place, delete all of that code that I just wrote, and we'll go for round 2.
Great. So hi, I'm Lily. I'll be your interviewer. How's it going today?
Good, thanks. Lily, how are you?
I'm not too bad. So today we'll be going through your coding interview. If you're ready to take the sort of problem, write it down.
Yep, I'm ready to go.
So today it will be a 2-sum question. Let's say we have a list of numbers. We want to find and return 2 indices in that list such that they add up to a certain target value. So if we had 1, 2, 5, 9 as the list of numbers with a target of 7, we'd want to return indices 1 and 2 because this corresponds to the numbers 2 and 5, which add up to 7. In another example, if we have -1, 3, and 9, and our target is 8, we'd want to return 0 and 2 because this corresponds to the numbers -1 and 9, which add together to give 8. You may not use the same element twice. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I seem to miss the second example there. Do you mind repeating that for me?
Yeah, no worries. So if we have -1, 3, and 9, and our target is 8, then we'd want to return 0 and 2 as the indices because this corresponds to the numbers -1 and 9, which add together to give 8.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for that. I think I just have another couple of questions, if that's all right. So I see here that we're accepting a list into our function. What would we do if the list was empty?
We'd return -1 for both indices.
Okay, so we're going to return -1 for both indices. And what in the case where I guess it'd probably be something similar if there isn't, if our numbers don't add up to the target? What do we do then?
Yet again, we'd return -1 for both indices.
So that just ends up being our default, is that above? Great, okay. What happens if there's more than one pair that add up to our target?
There won't be in the list you're given.
Okay, won't be more than add to target. Fantastic. And what is the output format you'd like?
So the output format we'd like is for you to return it as a list.
Then as a list. Okay. And should that be sorted in any way, or is it just whichever way around the indices come?
It should be sorted in reverse order.
Sorted in reverse order. Okay, great. Thank you. So let me just think of an example here. So let's say, I'll put it down below. Let's say I had something like -1, -2, 5, 4, and 10, and a target value of, let's see here, maybe 8. In that case, I'd want to return indices, it would be 1 and 4, because that would correspond to -2 and 10, which together sum to 8. Is that right?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Fantastic. Okay, I think I've got the idea. So the way I'd think about doing this would be to first have a look at a brute force solution. So for each element in the list, we could simply just loop through every other element and see if the first added to the second to produce our target value. If it did, we can return the indexes of those two. So I think if we think about that, kind of looping through and doing one for each, that would have a constant space complexity, but would have a time complexity of O(n) squared, where n is the number of elements in our list. So to be constant space, because we're not kind of creating any new lists or doing anything like that that's proportional to the size of the input. But it would be O(n) squared, because for each of those elements, we're looping through again in time, so we get to n squared. But I do think we can probably do better than that. So I think thinking about what the best conceivable runtime would be, we're going to have to visit, in our worst case at least, every single element, because we could assume it was the combination of the first element and the last element in our list. So in that case, the best conceivable runtime would be linear. So I think that's kind of around where we're aiming for, and I'll just take a moment to think about how I might get there.
Yeah, no worries. Just take your time.
Okay, so I think I can see in our brute force solution, we're doing repeated work each time. So let's say our target value is something like 10. And let's say one of the values in our list contains something, and then it also contains a 6. What we know then is that we need a 4 as our other value, because 6 and 4 obviously add to 10. So if we can somehow cache this information, if we've already seen or we end up seeing a 4, we know we've got our 2 numbers that we need. So in this case, we kind of want to store like the complement, and so the index at which it occurs. So I think the best data structure for this would be something like a hash table, as it will allow us to look up the index for a certain complement value in constant time. That's the benefit of a hash table. It also adds a linear space complexity, because we'll be storing at most one complement for each of our elements in that list. But at the very least, we'll have drastically increased from O(n) squared to linear, which is going to be a much better version of that, I think. What are your thoughts on that?
So that sounds good to me. Why don't you have a go coding that one up?
Sure. Okay. So I'll just try and think about that there. So I'll go with start with creating our function definition here. So it would be, we'd have our numbers coming in and the target that we want to reach. First thing I'm going to do is create our hash map, or dictionary as it's called in Python. And what we'll do is we want to iterate through each of our values first and see, and then basically calculate what add them into our hash map so that we can look them up in constant time. So that would be for I in range of the length of our numbers. So we're iterating through each one. We're just going to store into our hash map the value that's at numbers I. And that's going to be equal to our index. So we've added the key as being the value, and the the key as being the current number, and the value as being the index of that number. So once we've done that loop, we could also go through again, without having pre-computed all those, and we could then simply look through, work out what our complement would be, which would be the target minus our numbers I. Thank you, GitHub Autopilot. And if we can find out if that complement is in our hash map, correctly, we want to find out if it's in our hash map, but also part of our restriction is that it's not that our number itself. We can't use the same number twice. So we want to check that if our hash map complement is not equal to our value I, then what we're going to do is return our list, which GitHub code, it's almost right, but we actually want that sorted. And we're going to sort that with in the reverse. The reverse is going to equal true. If that doesn't work, we're going to go ahead and return our default value, which is going to be -1, just like that. Cool. Okay. I think that's my solution.
Cool. That looks pretty good to me, but I've just got a question for you. Do you think you do need to do that first loop?
Let me have a think.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I see what you mean. I think we can actually do it all in one pass, adding as we go and checking the values already in the hash table. So we're going to check the previous values, and then we also store it for those future values that might look at it. And then we just need one pass through.
Cool. Yeah, good thinking. Do you want to try and make that change now then?
Sure, yep, I will do. So we still need our definition there. We can get rid of our second loop and steal that line of code. And I think what we're going to do is check our complement. And we can change our check here to see if the complement's in the hash map, because we won't be checking the value itself because it won't have been added at the time we check. And so we can return it if we found it, but if not, we can just add that hash map's number and then return -1 in that default case again. So I think that gives us just that one pass through.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Cool. Okay, so that's our second fake interview there. So I'll leave my code editor up. But in terms of some of those improvements, we'll quickly walk through what a couple of those could have been. So for one thing, I went through and asked clarifying questions. What if it's an empty list? What happens if it doesn't add to the number, etc.? And that gave us a whole lot more information, including, quite crucially, that we needed to reverse the order of the indices when we returned them, which our kind of poor version of the interview didn't end up working out because they never asked. We also, going through, I sort of listened to what the interviewer said and used that to improve my answer. And it was also quite clear that I knew my data structures, because I knew that a hash table or a dictionary would give us constant time lookups, and that would mean that it would end up being a linear solution overall. So that's a few examples. Can anyone think of any other examples that we, ways that I did it that might have been better for that interview? Neat code? Yep. I'll answer. Sorry, it looks like there's a couple of questions as well.
You want to run through those while everyone's thinking as well?
Yeah, for sure. So is it necessary to write a description of the problem using comments? It's not. I've personally found it really helpful, because one of the things I find is when I get nervous, sometimes my brain sort of doesn't work quite as well. And so if you've had it written down, especially kind of the problems or the way you're going to go through it, it's really helpful. And it means you're not kind of forgetting and then constantly asking the interviewer. You can just have a look back at your notes. But in some interviews, they will actually paste some stuff in for you. Anything to add to that, Lou?
I think definitely just as long as you've got the core sort of metrics or ideas that you need to follow in front of you, then that's really helpful. But by putting it into comments like this, instead of, say, writing it down or whatnot, you've also got the interviewer who can, if you're sharing your screen, see the same comments. Then if you are kind of putting down the wrong information or otherwise, they may then also be able to clarify that for you immediately, so you're not going off track right off the base. Yeah,
definitely. Cool. Okay. And second question there is, would it be possibly be good to illustrate diagrams to further your understanding, possibly drawing diagrams, etc.? Yeah, that's a good suggestion. I think the issue there probably will be the time constraints of the interview. So being able to write out a diagram is quite difficult, especially in the kind of online version of it. If you're in person with a whiteboard, for sure, go to town. Bit harder in these situations. But also often if you need some kind of diagrammatic explanation, that'll often be provided to you by the interviewer. So it'll be included in the question. You can sort of see it from that, and then perhaps kind of edit that or do it as such. Are there any dumb questions such as clarify indices and factor index? No. If you don't understand something, you don't want to just pretend that you do and go ahead, because you're quite, you could be well make a mistake from it. So definitely going ahead and clarifying that, even if you think it's a dumb question, would definitely be the right approach there. But yeah, the more you know some of them, like I guess if you're needing to ask, say, what a hash map is, that might not be as good if it's one of those basic data structures that's in that Cracking the Coding interview book that they might expect you to know. Yeah. Cool. Okay. And another question. Apologies, this sounds rude, but there'll be some mock interviews that cover other industries such as investment banking. So for this particular stuff, it's more based on those coding interviews. We don't have anything prepared for that tonight. But certainly there might be some people within devs that would be able to give you a hand with that, or even in other clubs too. But unfortunately, we won't go through that tonight.
Yeah, I think especially with investment banking, what you'll I spent my summer working for an investment bank basically, but as an engineer. So what I can say is I can definitely give a lot of insight on the engineering side of things if you're looking to apply either as sort of a quantitative engineer or just software in general. But if you're looking to jump straight into the investment banking side of their interviews, then that one I can definitely fish around and see if I can find some information. So if you want to message me later on LinkedIn or something, just find me there. Then yeah, I'll definitely see what I can find out.
Awesome. Okay. And last couple of things, I think, is in terms of things that we could have also done in that interview, also started with brute force, which was quite good. So we could talk about that. We talked about our time complexity and our space complexity and how those changed with our solution. And we definitely gave a better explanation overall, as was said. But the one thing that we missed probably was testing our code. We never actually went through and did that, but frankly, that's partially due to the time constraints. How would I rate this problem of difficulty compared to other problems that typically asked in a technical interview? This problem is a leaked code easy question. So typically, these kind of ones wouldn't usually come up in your code pairing for Aussie ones, at very least in my experience. It's much more ones along the lines of kind of probably around the medium level, and especially for likes of Optiver, IMC, Acuna Capital, the kind of fintech firms. My experience has been their questions are much more kind of medium to hard range. But certainly you can get these kinds of levels in like so the code screenings. You might get a combination of these in medium. Anything else, Ollie?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I think I've had interviews where they've just straight up only asked like, how would you round a bunch of numbers? So that was a question I got asked from Xero last year. I've had a question about like chess pieces jumping around boards. They do really vary in their difficulty, but I think what you do tend to find is if you run your way through a lot of these questions, they end up being relatively the same, and you'll start to see sort of that coming through when you do those interviews, because I've had like that phase of running through a whole bunch of HackerRank questions, and then 2 months down the line I go into sort of that like initial technical interview or assessment, and several of those same concepts have come up. They've just been framed slightly differently. And yeah, I think that's what I have to say from that. Just to jump onto some of the other questions, should you comment your code? I think in an interview like that, because you've got an opportunity to explain it, you don't really need to comment it. And in general, I think as well, my understanding of it is that in industry, a lot of commenting actually like is done either from your tickets or otherwise, or just your code in of itself should be relatively self-explanatory. You shouldn't need a lot of comments to be supplementary in order to understand it. I think as well, university really emphasizes the importance of putting your comments through, but then at the end of the day, once you get to industry, it really is more about how you're coding rather than trying to explain the code itself. So if your code is rather convoluted or has some ideas or things that may need to be otherwise explained, then by all means add a comment. But I would say usually in a coding interview, you won't come across anything as in-depth as that needs the additional commentary.
Definitely, I'd agree with that. Or as I sort of said, if you do, you're probably you kind of should be articulating it as you go as well. So that should hopefully cover it off without needing any comments, because you are also restricted by time. So the interviewer will probably encourage you not to write those comments so that you got more time for the code itself. Maybe we'll go to the next one. Have you seen questions in your interview directly from leak code? I haven't. You'll get, it's kind of more the style or level of questions that you'll see, but companies that I'm aware of, at the very least, these the Australian companies that I've interviewed for, they're not going to pull questions straight from leak code, because then people will know the answer, by having just practiced with leak code potentially.
Yeah.
They're wanting to check your own understanding of how you'd approach these problems. So they'll have ones that are similar difficulty, but definitely not the same questions. In fact, I know, for example, with Google, they've got a big list of questions that were Google interview questions that they no longer ask because they've been leaked to the public. So they definitely come up with their own new ones.
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree with that as well. I've seen very much similar questions, but not necessarily the exact same, especially because some of these questions get leaked. I have, after interviews, for example, Googled the question, then found the exact solution, which is, I think, a bit dicey, but it does end up happening sometimes. But what you'll usually see is that a lot of these are more just utilizing concepts. So for example, if you're using a search algorithm, then you might get one with that's a chessboard question, or just something finding a shortest path. And so that's what they'll employ. And as long as you've got the understanding of the algorithm, then fitting it to context shouldn't be too much more difficult. It's like a half step up from that point.
But it is definitely one of those ones where the more you practice, especially with leak code and with HackerRank, with other sites, there's only a certain number of questions that they can kind of ask of these types. The more you'll get experience using your data structures, using your algorithms, especially, I mean, the fintech seem to love graph algorithms. So your breadth first search, depth first search, bidirectional search. So the more that you practice with those, get familiar with those, the more you'll see them. In fact, actually, I've, in terms of the code pairs that I've done at Acuna and Optiver, and actually at IMC as well, all of those have been breadth first search or bidirectional search related. So it's like they love the kind of graph algorithm ones. Yeah, so the more you practice those, the easier they get, I think, essentially.
So how common is it to have the live coding interview rather than take-home assessment? I'd say a lot more common.
to clarify with that, I think, so you'll usually with these companies, you'll do a code screening first. So that's like an online HackerRank kind of style one. And that's, that's just you and test cases, nothing else. So you do that first. And then if you pass that, you will often get through maybe to a phone interview, maybe not. But then the next kind of stage after that is a one-on-one code interview, like Lily and I demonstrated before. And then often after that, there's a final interview where you'll do one of those again. So you'll kind of get a combination of both. But if you meant a take-home assessment, like Rishi was chatting about, I think it was Rishi asked about earlier, it's less likely, I think, to get those from, at the very least, some of the Australian companies we've named.
I think I've heard of it most like one of them giving a take-home assignment, and
yeah.
I don't even remember if they actually do that now. Like it's, I think, become increasingly uncommon. Especially because you kind of just have like a lot of other options, like having that sort of screening one, or having that one-on-one.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Just last couple of questions before we move on. Is there any tips for you if you bomb the technical assessment? Do you mean kind of during it or after it? Because I guess if it's after it, it's that's what we chatted about before, about trying to reflect on it and use that information for next time. It's pretty hard to do anything once it's done. And if it's during, for one thing, I definitely know how you feel. That's happened to me before. I think the biggest thing there is to try and stay calm, because you can often, even again, if you're going, I can't understand most of this, I can't get to an optimal solution, put brute force down. You might be surprised. That might be enough because you've shown, that your coding style is good. You've used good code. Maybe you put in a few comments if you needed to, and you've thought about edge cases, etc. too. Sometimes that can be enough, and you often do much better than you thought you were doing at the time. So basically, don't panic. You'll probably do pretty well. Or if not, learn for next time. Yeah, cool.
For sure. I think having the opportunity to reflect on the things you just missed, even if they're like super simple and you don't even know why you missed them, just making sure that you're taking that time as well to just not do that again. For example, to really roast myself here publicly, there was one point I had a coding interview, like the technical assessment, and for some reason I decided that was the optimal time to forget how to just write like a class, like to start it. So yeah, I think keeping calm and just really trying to just nail those basics as well, that really helps, and you just keep kind of getting that chance to reflect if it doesn't go well, or if you feel it hasn't gone well, and then building up from that.
So that's, I guess, some of the nerves and stuff as well are helped by the more practice, because the more practice, the more times you've done it, the less likely, it just becomes second nature. It's sort of almost muscle memory, actually. And I think the kind of last question before moving on was, should you mention that you would comment your code if it was a more difficult concept? Yep, I think that's a great idea. There's probably no harm in doing that.
Yeah, I'll just quickly jump on that last question. Any tips if you're second year and haven't done any papers in data algo? I think Rishi's right in that most of these sort of majors will give you a paper in your second semester if you haven't had one yet, and they'll touch on them. I found though, at least with CompSys, as that's my major, I didn't get a lot of depth into it. They did give a relatively good understanding of just time complexity and how that worked. But in regards to data algorithms and data structures and algorithms in of themselves, there's so many sort of different things that it's, I think, impossible for them to just cover that much in sort of one course. So what I think we would really push is getting your own opportunity to do external learning, either through things like HackerRank, LeetCode and all that, or just reading up on sites. There's some really good ones like Geeks for Geeks explains their concepts really well, and just getting familiar with sort of the principles that they bring forward and how to utilize them, and good opportunities to utilize them, because university, I'd say, is not necessarily the only way, and it's definitely also just not necessarily the best way. It's all really dependent as well, I think, on what you're aiming to achieve. And I think as well, if you're looking at Australia as more of a long-term goal, then what you can also do is really utilize your opportunities within New Zealand to find sort of an internship that really kicks off your learning as well. Or if you find that you just don't yet have those opportunities to do that learning, because that was what I did essentially. I didn't try and make that jump across until third year, but instead I kind of focused on staying within New Zealand first, getting that experience and kind of getting an opportunity to learn while being paid to do so, and then jumping over and making the most of what was over there as well.
Yeah, definitely. And the one thing I'll add to that, I think, is that the Cracking the Coding interview book is a godsend for that kind of thing. You really want to... They cover all of those data structures and algorithms that you could need, and it does them actually in a pretty at the very least, there's enough of that information that you can start to Google a bit more around it and use that to structure it. So when I was going through, I just made sure that all the data structures and algorithms that were in that book I knew about and had gone through and understood and could implement. And that was definitely like more than enough, I think, and really helpful in terms of securing some of those roles. Cool. And last question. How long did you practice leak code until you got familiar enough with these questions? That's kind of a challenging question to ask. It'll depend on the person, what your familiarity is with these sorts of questions, that sort of thing. I think you're basically just wanting to do it till you feel comfortable. And once you do a couple of interviews as well, you'll sort of see the difficulty and you'll go, oh, those are a bit hard. I might need to do a bit more practice on my graph algorithms. Or you'll go, no, those are easy and I really enjoyed it. So you should be able, that's kind of a personal thing, I think. Just to have a go and see where you get to.
Bit of a guilty admission. I didn't do it for, I think, too long. But I think if you make that push, especially sort of leading up to your interviews, it really does help to solidify that knowledge. What I would have done differently, though, for sure, is trying to put aside some time, maybe every day or every other day, to learn those concepts, because I didn't really get kind of more invested into it until it was a bit late, and I'd already missed a couple of the opportunities I was really invested in. And then I got kind of lucky that I didn't need a technical interview for where I did end up. So yeah, I would say just following from what Adam said, put in the time that you feel is kind of appropriate or when you're starting to feel comfortable, but make sure you're getting into it earlier and you're really sort of getting in depth with different concepts, especially those that you don't know very well. And then once you do feel comfortable with one, just feel comfortable maybe to like shelve it for a few weeks or whatever, so that you're able to focus on those new things and get that little breadth of knowledge.
Cool. Fantastic. Okay, well, I think that just about takes us through. So before we kind of move into the mock interviews and getting all of you to have a go, would really appreciate if you take the time to give us some feedback on how you felt today's workshop went and if you've gotten some value from it. And kind of PS, this is the way you can go in the draw to win those 4 Apple AirTags. It's how we can hopefully take your attendance too. So feel free to follow through that link, or at the front of the stage, not on the stage, but the front of the stage, there's a couple of boards that should have the link that you can follow through to our feedback form. Cool. Okay. So I'll pass back to Lily.
Great. So it's mock interviews time. So it's your turn essentially. If you guys want to split into pairs, we've kind of in the like gather town space in the upstairs. There's a couple of different rooms, so you can just pair up and have a little private room. So just find someone, say hello. Think of it like Club Penguin, where you just end up doing kajitsu, and then just follow the pinned link to see the interview questions that we've prepared for you. So one of you will be able to conduct the first question as the interviewer, and then the second one you'll be able to act as the interviewee, and just switching those roles essentially. So we'll also be around to help if you need. Otherwise, just walk through sort of, I think it's labeled as B, and you'll be able to get upstairs to that space and then just pick one. And otherwise, just it's really, I think, valuable to be able to get this opportunity to practice as well, and it's better here than in the actual interview. So just do make sure that you're taking that effort to stick around and kind of just try out a few of these questions so you get the hang of it before you're really in the real deal. But other than that, thank you guys for your time, and hopefully you had hopefully you learned something from this today.
Thank you. So I think also, just so you know, the link to that paired mock interview is hopefully up the front as well. But any of the issues there, we can drop it in the chat too. In fact, I might try and do that too. But apart from that, if you really don't want to do it, fair enough. Thank you much for coming. But we do really encourage it. It's really good practice, and the more practice you get, the better. So we'll try and help you split up if you can't find someone. Come to us and we'll chat. Cool.
Great.
But hopefully you enjoyed today. Yeah, cheers. I'll stop sharing my screen and move around. I'm also happy to take any more questions if people have them.
Yeah, if anyone just wants to ping me, then I'm like, feel free, just like, you don't even have to post it publicly. You can just DM it to me on GatherTown, and I'll try answer it to my best abilities.
Yep. Anything like that. Or if you need help finding a buddy, we can do that too. In fact, I think you can even like message in the chat and then find a buddy to work with. Oh, did I miss Mandy? We're good. Cool. Oh, forgot to tell people that there was prizes, but those prizes will find. They'll find out. They were secret prizes.
I think I said existed once, and then like I think I mentioned they existed once and then never again. So
Yeah,
very,
I forgot. I meant
very
to
good.
announce them. Yeah, meant to announce them as we went through, but I forgot. So that's good. But
Yeah.
it'll be a nice surprise
Yeah.
to them when they get those vouchers coming into their inbox.
But yeah, if you guys are just trying to get a room, just essentially follow through those side doors up the top, and it should take you to a new room.
Yeah. Or as I said, if you haven't found someone to chat with, let us know. Flick me a message or something. Aaron asks, would you recommend practicing coding interview problems in more than one language in case a company has limited choice of selections, limited section of choices? Great question. From my perspective here, it really depends on what companies you're wanting to apply for. So likes of some of the fintechs, I know like Optiver and IMC request either Java or C++ because they're wanting really low latency code, whereas most other places will accept most other languages. So like Google, you can code in basically any language you want to, Python, JavaScript, Go, you name it. Same with Atlassian, same I think with Canva. So yeah, you can basically code with what you feel comfortable in. I think the danger if you practice in more than one language is that you can start to get a bit confused between the API calls. So unless there's specific companies that you want to apply for, say likes of Optiver, but you'd also like to apply for Google or whatever, but feel more comfortable in something like Python, that might be a time to do both languages, because that's in fact what I did when applying for those companies respectively. But unless you really need to, it's probably better to keep going in that same language so you get really familiar with its API and can just kind of bang out anything on it. Anything to add, Linda?
I think I would definitely agree with those points. My personal experience has been that a lot of the time you will kind of get a lot of these sort of common languages anyway as an option. So for example, I think when I had the opportunity to do a couple of these technical interviews, they were a lot more refined in the languages that they were offering, but they were still kind of one of the big players, like it'll be JavaScript or Java. So if you're planning on specializing all your knowledge in a language such as Go or Rust, it might be a bit more difficult down the line. But as long as you're sort of, I think, learning some of those big ones, like Python's really good, as mentioned, for like data and etc., or just essentially thinking about the places you want to go. So for example, with those fintech companies, because they have a big focus on specific things such as data or low latency or whatnot, then getting kind of more adjusted to languages such as C++, Python, or if you're looking to just go into sort of a lot more of that maybe front-end development and getting familiar with JavaScript. I will figure out where you are in a second, Rishi, because we did have some interesting stuff happen earlier. But yeah, he's on the stage. Cool. So yeah, I think a lot of these languages you can essentially just bank on having, if you've got knowledge in some really common ones such as JavaScript, or Python, then that will be really helpful. And I think as well with C and Java, conceptually they're pretty similar. So if you do get familiar with one of them, then adjusting to the second one, if you're trying to just jump between, say, backend roles and like low latency performance sort of stuff, that shouldn't be too hard either. But for the most part, you can usually just run your way through because they care more about the performance of like your test cases or whatnot than just analyzing every line you've written.
Yeah, definitely. And do you want to take the next question as well?
Do interviews have the same interview processes? Internships have the same interview processes as what you've mentioned today, or is it more aimed at grad roles? I think we're both thinking about it from an internship perspective. I haven't actually been too far in the grad role search.
I've done both, and they are very similar. Basically, just the style of questions for grad might be slightly harder than what you get in the internship, just because you've had a bit more time, and so the expectation of your knowledge might change slightly. But yeah, for the most part, like all that we've described is basically the same. Yeah. In my experience, at the very least.
Actually, yeah, the more I think about it, I think last year when I was interviewing with IMC, they said that their grads and interns pretty much go through the same interview process. Like there are a couple of grad interviewees or something there on the day with the intern interviewers. And so that was kind of like not a lot of, but I think there are several companies like FNZ as well, which is more New Zealand based. But as another example, they have their internship and grad sort of interviews pretty localized into the same sort of process. And the rationale in of itself was just, if we like you, irrespective of if you go with us for internships, then we'll still want you for grad. So I think depending on the company, they'll obviously sometimes switch it up. They might expect a greater breadth of knowledge, but otherwise, at the least, a lot of these principles will come through the same way. How necessary is an internship? Can you go straight into grad roles? I mean, definitely. Never say never, right? Like,
yeah, no, you definitely can go straight into them. Many people do, in fact. I mean, part of the internships that we're kind of familiar with is for engineering, you need 800 hours of practical work, so that's part of the drive to get those internships. But yeah, definitely you can go through without them. But I think they're quite good both for helping your CV, so you've kind of gone through the process before you know what you're doing. It helps with practice for those grad role interviews because you've already done them for the internship. And they're also just really great chance to experience the company before you potentially apply to them, because it's from both your perspective and their perspective. It's a 3-month trial basically of what do you like, how do you like that company, what's it like to work for, what's the work actually like.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, I think I'd really encourage them, but they're not necessarily. Is it compulsory for 800 hours to do internships? For Eng, you need to do something. So internships are usually the way people get those hours, except for part-time work.
It's internship or research project, but I think research is a lot harder to actually get, just because of not as many sort of research projects around, and B, I would just say in general, it's really valuable as well, financially, to go and get an internship, especially if you end up at somewhere like a bank. So if you're concerned about that as well, then it's definitely worth diving into that. And I think as well, just to jump on the points that Adam's made, getting an internship as well, it also really shows you sort of the facets of the sort of career path you might be going down, and getting experience in the industry and deciding if it's right for you. So for example, if you end up at a startup and you decide, oh, this kind of culture or this grind may not be for me, then you might want to say, jump over to a larger organization where they have that set 9 to 5. Here's a very specific sort of set of things you have to do. You don't have to be across the board and everything. So yeah, I think as well, by getting an internship, get a far better feel of the day-to-day for the work that you're doing, and whether it's even necessarily the work you want to be doing at all. So if, say, for example, you spend a summer or two doing software development and then decide that you actually hate it, it's far better than getting into a grad role and trying to decide that, am I going to be here forever because I've now graduated and this is kind of my starting point.
This last question. If you interviewed a specific language, would they expect you to use that language if you get the job? Yes, potentially, but there's no, I think you'd be expected to be able to use that language in your work, but you've shown that you can do that because you passed the interview. But they may also ask you to use another language, learn something completely different. I mean, for example, with my internship over summer with Google, I interviewed in Python and then worked entirely in Go and then some other proprietary stuff. So didn't use any Python at all. So I think it really depends on the job and what you end up applying for. But whereas if you're applying for a web dev role and you apply in JavaScript, you're quite likely to use that JavaScript. But yeah, they should specify that on the role, what you'll end up working in.
Yeah, I think they'll generally give a relative indication of what you should be working in. I think in those instances as well, it does sort of pay to be coding in those languages.